The Pity in the Penitentiary. Theodore Harris Fields, age 21, Davidson County Jail, 2026. He got his thumbs and fingers inked and stamped and digitally preserved. He was booked at 4:45 p.m. and was given a sack lunch to eat during the booking process. The prisoners sat in the waiting area for the nurse to call each of their names one by one to receive medical information such as allergies and medications each individual is on. However, nobody got their medications if they were only in for a few days. Mr. Fields luckily did not suffer from allergies except for poison ivy and bee stings.
You won't have to worry about that in here.
The nurse laughed her smoky laugh, which turned into a cough, wrinkling her baked forehead on her 40-year-old face, which had been slowly smoked for 27 years without a break. She beamed a huge yellow-toothed grin as Fields looked back at her through the cloud of smoke with a sad look of forlorn.
Are you on any medications?
No, Fields replied.
Have you left the country in the past 7 years, Mr. Fields?
No, ma'am. He looked down at his flat feet poking out of his orange, undersized jail slippers. She asked him a few more questions and said,
You may go ahead and sit back down.
Fields noticed her name tag, Katzenberger. He pumped himself some hand sanitizer before turning away from Nurse Katzenberger's station window. Fields walked over to the highly uncomfortable benches where they waited for hours to be brought to their cells. The television played quietly with subtitles, a marathon of old films starring Denzel Washington. He tried to nap, but a guard tapped him sharply on the shoulder, saying, "No napping." The same guard had earlier argued aggressively with one prisoner about the bathroom policy. Fields tried his best to stay awake. Finally, it came time for the group of criminals to be transferred to their holding cell block and given their blankets. No pillows were given, but this not being Fields' first rodeo, he knew there were 2 blankets that were given to each prisoner, and he would always roll one under his head. The next day, he was transferred to the state penitentiary. His crime? Bootlegging hard liquors and smoking products to his peers at the shoe factory. Even though Theodore was just barely 21, he had been in and out of juvenile correction centers in 4 different counties as a troubled teenager. This was just the big boy version. His mother was single, working for 16 hours a day, sleeping only 5 hours a night and all weekend long. His father left when Theodore was 4, right after his older brother had just passed away. It was quite damaging to the family, his brother's passing and his sudden departure of his father. Fields remembered his father getting into a blue pickup truck that the family never owned or saw before, with a red-headed woman wearing a tank top and sunglasses in the driver's seat. That was the last time he saw his father, and he really had no desire to meet him again. Fields took a nap in his new cell around 1 p.m. when he was woken up the next morning. He had no intention of sleeping that long, but he had nowhere to be. Breakfast was slid into the chute of his cell door, a large archaic chunk of steel with paint chips, reminiscent of an old high school locker. He was served eggs and ham without any salt or spices, and cold slices of potatoes that were not fully cooked. They gave him a small milk carton and a decaf coffee flavoring mix, which he took advantage of, knowing he had no more use for the real deal. What did he need caffeine energy for anyways? He had nothing to do but sleep, do push-ups, use the bathroom. And when the prisoners were let out that afternoon in the yard, Fields found his way to the jail's library inside. It was in a room that had several shelves, but only one shelf was full of books. They ranged from John Grisham to James Patterson, Dan Brown to Walter Flagg. Theodore Fields kept searching for something that might grab his interest. He had already read everything that Walter Flagg put out, and one could easily say that Fields was a superfan of the Walter Flagg multiverse, as the literati called it. Fields finally saw some classics, like Hate in the Time of Cholera, The Man in the Low Trenches, and an Edgar Allan Poe collection, among many others. Fields was right where he needed to be, he thought, as he perused some more. He decided to be quick as another prisoner entered, and he wanted to give the other man some space for his own choosing. It was then that Fields noticed something that made him very upset. A copy of Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler stood by a book on the history of the Eiffel Tower's construction. Fields grabbed it instinctively as if to investigate that it was really there. And it was. Looking up at him, the German words for my struggles, and that name that made his hair stand up on end, made goose pimples form up and down his spine, neck, arms, and legs. Dude, can you fucking believe this shit? He showed the book to his fellow book lover, who also donned the pink and blue jail outfit and the neon bright orange slippers. The fellow rolled his eyes and just said, "Yeah?" Fields was going to put it back on the shelf where it was, when he thought of the history of the book itself. How it had been written by a then not-so-famous Hitler inside a jail not so unlike the one he was in now. He thought of the guys on the cell block, and how some poor misguided soul driven by hate could be inspired by Adolf's words and the dark shadow he left on the world. Fields decided to take the book to the supervising officer sitting behind the computer desk in the middle of the cell block. "Hey, officer," the name tag said. "Jones? I'm sorry to bother you, but I have a concern about a book in the collection we got to choose from. I really think it may have been a mistake. I don't think this belongs in a place like this." Fields began to stutter as he revealed the cover to a giant muscular cop who looked him in the eyes for about 3 seconds and began to explain as if on autopilot. "Sir, we don't control the contents of that there library. They're all donated by citizens. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm very busy. I cannot be bothered one bit." Fields understood and left the officer alone. He skimmed through the book before realizing he could be seen with it. A horrible thing to have in one's hands, on one's reputation for sure, he thought. He meandered in a subtle manner back to the library and put the book next to a few books about American presidents and national parks. He couldn't help the situation, so he grabbed the old collection of Edgar Allan Poe and returned to his cell. The book had poems in the first half and short stories in the second half. He read the poems, but nothing his eyes looked at sank in, nothing absorbed. He may as well have been looking at hieroglyphics. He had read them all before. He could not get the image of that dastardly book cover out of his mind. Mein Kampf. He could not clear away the vision of the mustached dictator and the large black words on the yellow book cover. How it had tried so hard to blend in, clearly where it does not belong. Fields wrestled and fought these images and his general disdain in his mind, and realized his heart was pounding. He'd even broke a sweat. Fields was determined to do something. He grabbed his jail-safe pen that they gave each prisoner and his yellow legal pad, and he began to write. Dear Warden Braun, I am without doubt ashamed that there is no oversight whatsoever as to the contents of the library on our cell block. Everything is permissible with one glaring exception. In what universe should we allow books by individuals such as the late European Chancellor? Yes, I have seen the history books. I understand he unified Europe under one government, and yes, I am aware he is highly respected in history. I am also aware of how easily dismissed my words are, which probably strike one as alarmist, or even fringe and nutty. It is clear to me that New Germany is a close ally to the United States. I understand who I speak out against. I doubt my case is at all supported, especially following his successor and son's deaths last year. However, he left over time 1 billion skeletons and thousands of mass graves, all with the power of his words. And not just any words. Persuasive words that sound sweet to closed ears, ready to be opened in the cause of hate, division, and murder. He is the epitome of how propaganda can make or break whole peoples. Farewell to the nations that many of our ancestors came from. Poland, Switzerland, Scotland, Norway, and so on. We'll never know our true history after that furor of pure evil stamped out in the night. The many museums and cultural heritage centers, libraries, archive offices. We cannot afford to continue celebrating the perpetrator of these historical mass genocides, justified by anger and mob mentalities from the 1930s to the present day, even decades after his death of old age in 1976. It is with a great imperative that you reconsider the placement of this book in any library, let alone the penitentiary bookshelves. I respect your time, and I truly hope this letter reaches you and finds you with an open ear and a heart that can guide you to making wise and just decisions. There are so many books that could replace this work of sheer evil, and I have even prepared a list of examples on the next page. Thanks, Theodore H. Fields. Mr. Fields looked over his letter to be sure he hadn't gone too far. He was picky about word choice, and there was only an hour left before it was lights out. After carefully rereading the letter, checking for errors, he folded it and put it in an envelope and wrote, "For Warden Braun," on the front. He shoved it into the jail letter pile sitting in the outbox. Half of them were in English, the rest were either German or Spanish. Fields could read and speak 6 different languages, unlike most young men in America. It was a good thing, for the dominance of German and English seemed to keep the other prisoners from the books printed in the 3rd most common language, Spanish. It also gave Mr. Fields the ability to read his copy of La Poesía y los Cuentos de Edgar Allan Poe when he could focus on reading at all. Though Mr. Fields wrote his heartfelt letter, he could not read the last few poems of the Spanish translation of Poe's collected works. After El Cuervo, quoth the raven, nevermore. After Las Campanas, the bells, bells, bells. They rang in his ears all night. He turned a page, but he swore he could only see a swirl of swastikas and the German words for my struggles printed up and down the page. He carefully set his book beside the mattress he laid on, knowing his mind was just playing tricks on him. He laid back and closed his eyes. An inmate 2 cells down was screaming and slamming his mattress around all night. Was not a single officer stopping him. Mr. Fields heard the poor soul very well as he screamed and moaned, cursing in German. A huge pounding sound every 5 minutes resounded on their floor. Fields turned over trying to sleep as he distinctly remembered the news of the Nazi Party victory in the United States. How lots of folks ended up changing their way of living. More specifically, Fields remembered his first night in jail. It was Christmas Eve and he was only 12 years old. He had been walking around town with $10 and an appetite for ice cream and root beer. The boy stumbled on a large crowd of people chanting some slogans and marching. He was unable to catch what they were saying. As he approached them out of sheer curiosity, he saw them protesting the reinstatement of President Bush for a 4th term. He was too young to know anything about Nazis when the relatively small group of protesters were approached by an angry mob. Soon after came the cops. One police officer looked down and smiled at the 12-year-old, who merely had a sweet tooth, scared and confused. The officer smiled at him and not too soon after spat right into the boy's eyes. Fields remembered the whole thing as he attacked the cop by punching him in the groin. The cop fighting back brutally as more cops appeared and an angry mob of protesters broke out in the fight with an angry mob of Nazis. And the cops seemed to only target the protesters. Ever since the night that he received his worst injuries ever in life, he grew up with a certain disdain for authority and hatred. The book of Poe left open, the inmate down the way screaming in German. Fields could not sleep, read, or even rest. He was sweating again, his forehead cold, as he heard that vicious voice inside his head and the anguished voice 2 cells over, all meshing together in their German likeness. He drifted into a deep sleep filled with nightmares, the book cover for Mein Kampf circling around his dream visions, accompanied by silver eagles, large black boots marching up and down, and young men of many generations and backgrounds saluting upwards. Swastikas rolling around his own hometown like tumbleweeds to plant seeds of hatred in what had become in his dreams a desert wasteland of these screams and shapes and monsters. It was too much for Mr. Fields, the mere presence of that book down the hall in that library room. That room should be a prisoner's sanctuary, not a soapbox of vitriol, not a pedestal for loathing the common man, an abhorrence for ethics or literary abominations that bastardize any shelf it touched. The night finally ceased roaring loudly. The sun came up. Outside, the birds chirped up the pink and brightening skies, and inside each inmate was doled out their breakfast again. Cold potatoes and stale fruit today. Mr. Fields did not get up to receive his meal. Nobody noticed until it was time to retrieve the dirty trays. Everyone else had eaten their breakfast, as horrible as it felt in one's mouth and tasted to one's tongue. Oh, what a shame, the poor dear. Nurse Schlitz pressed her finger to Mr. Fields' wrist and then his temple. An autopsy will determine time and cause of death. She looked beside his bed where he laid with his eyes wide open and his mouth open wider. She spoke to the officers crowding the entrance to Mr. Fields' cell. What a pity. A lover of books, too. So young and so frightened. My guess is a myocardial infarction, but we won't know for sure until we get that autopsy. Make way. She gestured behind the officers to let the medics come into Mr. Fields' cell to put his body on that sadly covered gurney to be rolled out of the state penitentiary. The book of Poe laid wide open to the page where short stories began and poems ended, with each poem and story in Spanish. This one was titled El Corazón del Autor. In English, it was simply The Telltale Heart. Nurse Schlitz's words that she spoke to Nurse Katzenberger were correct after all. It was indeed a pity.